Hands. Everyone's favorite thing to draw. I say with a hefty dose of sarcasm. Personally, I like to think of hands as an old nemesis of mine. You'd think they'd be easy to draw, but spoiler alert, they're not. Not really. Hands are pretty complex. You can use them for many different things, such as grabbing an apple, reading a book, drawing, contemplating the size of the universe, and much more. But they're also a very complex structure to draw. And to be honest, I'm not sure why. Long ago, when I was a simple artist drawing simple stuff, the art of drawing hands and making them look good eluded me. As I'm sure they did for many other people. Putting the hand behind the back or having your character's hands resemble oven mitts comes to mind. I guess if there's anyone or anything to blame for us artists now having to grapple with drawing the things we use to draw, it's that one fish who crawled out of the ocean 100 million years or so ago. I forget how long ago it was, sorry. But my point here is that, frankly, I'm tired of being outwitted and outdone by hands. So to combat my long-standing dilemma, I committed myself to a week of drawing hands. Earlier this year, I spent 2 weeks trying to improve my background drawing game, and the results of that have left me determined to finally become better at the art-related issues that have plagued me over the years. This special undertaking entailed not only getting to know the shapes that comprise the hand, but also giving each part their own attention so that I wouldn't mess my studies up too much. And to make things fun and maybe also keep my sanity intact, I decided to do some shading/rendering studies with some of those hands as well. After all, placement of the shadows and highlights is also key to making your hand drawings believable. So if you're new here and you want to see me tackle my longtime nemesis, then make sure to like and subscribe. And if you're already subscribed, then welcome back to the spaghetti layer. Either way, strap your butts in because here we go! First, let's get to my history with hands. I've heard stories of many people putting a character's hands behind their back early in their art journeys to get out of drawing hands altogether. You've probably done it yourself, and I don't blame you. Drawing hands is hard. I can't remember how often I did this in my youth, but I know I was guilty of doing this at least once. The big thing that I did as a kid, though, was making my character's hands look like they were wearing mittens. And if it wasn't that, then they just had circular shapes for hands. And to make matters worse, my phase of drawing oven mitt hands followed me partially into high school. It wasn't long before things started to turn around though, because about halfway into my first year, I finally started drawing the individual fingers. In other words, I drew something that at least partially resembled hands. And not gonna lie, I still think these were pretty good initial attempts at drawing hands. Even though, true to my skill set at the time, they were a little lacking. It was only up from there, but there were many problems when it came to drawing hands that continued to elude me as time went on. Some of the issues that plagued me well after college included the lengths of the individual fingers and my long-standing tendency to draw the fingers in 2 sections instead of 3. Unless I had reference images on hand, the finished drawing would often have the hands looking stiff, or I'd have them be very close to a character's body. As I said earlier, I think it's time that I level up my hand drawing skills. Because while I feel like I've come a long way with my illustrations, it doesn't really mean much if I don't give certain aspects of the bigger picture enough attention. And that includes hands. But before we get to the meat and the potatoes of this video, we need to understand what goes into drawing a hand. The hand is made up of multiple shapes, all of them rectangular in shape save for the palm, which I would say resembles more of a square or rhombus type shape. Or whatever you call this. There are 4 fingers and 1 thumb, and they're all divided into 3 individual sections, the last of which ends in a rounded shape for the fingertips along with a nail. The thumb may look like it has 2 sections, but the 3rd section actually starts where the wrist ends and is technically part of the palm. At least one drawing. And we can't forget about these lines on the palm itself. The middle finger is the longest of the fingers, extending slightly past the index and the ring fingers, which are about the same length. The pinky ends just before the 3rd joint of the ring finger, and the thumb ends just above the knuckle of the index finger. So now that that's out of the way, let's get to my adventures in hand studies. For all of my reference photos, I grabbed some images that I found and saved on Pinterest over the last couple of years. Did I predict this video in advance? Maybe. I wanted to give myself a challenge, but at the same time I didn't want to drive myself absolutely mad during my studies. So I settled for hand gestures that I considered to be medium difficulty. Nothing that I considered to be full head-on camera shots of the hand that didn't have any depth or complexity to them, but at the same time nothing that defied the laws of the universe or something. While the first couple of days of my week-long studies more or less consisted of me getting my feet wet, I also took this time as seriously as I did throughout the entire week. I made sure to pay attention to the position of each finger in the photo, and the position of each structure and shape in relation to the next, and trying to match the reference image as closely as possible. I also checked the length and width of each individual shape periodically to make sure I wasn't messing anything up. and if I was, I simply went over the initial brushstrokes with an eraser set to about 50% opacity and then drew over it, readjusting as needed. Under other circumstances, I would just use the lasso section tool and move an area of my art accordingly, but since these studies were done with a goal of improving my hand drawing game, I didn't want to take the easy way out. Except for one instance at the very end of the week, but we don't talk about that. Something else that I did for these studies that I don't usually do was draw the individual fingernails. Yeah, I don't know why I refrained from drawing them either. Before going into my studies, I had actually seen someone else mention that drawing the nail first is a good foundational point when drawing the hand. After you've drawn the palm, of course. I thought this was interesting information, especially as someone who doesn't usually draw nails unless a character is wearing nail polish or something. So I tried to work with that while also figuring out and deciding what method of drawing the hands worked for me. And as it turns out, starting with a nail can be useful in determining whether the corresponding finger ends in relation to the adjacent fingers. In comparison to some of the later studies, these first sketches were a little more refined. I started with a rough sketch as I usually do, but once I was satisfied with the sketch, I'd go over it with a more refined sketch that veered into line art territory. Then again, this most likely does qualify as line art anyway, so what's really going on here? Anyhow, as I sketched and drew each shape, I made sure to pay attention to the curvy and squishy bits of the palm, as well as each indentation. And I also made sure to ask myself, where does each finger end in relation to the one next to it, as well as to the palm? If the hand is curled inward, does the finger stop near the base of the hand, or is the apparent position of the fingertip more towards the base of the finger? How does each joint bend, and how long should each shape representing the finger joints be? Where does the hand end and the wrist begin? And how are they connected in each pose? And also, how does each part of the hand move depending on the pose? If the hand you're studying from, whether it's a reference photo or your own hand, is posed a certain way, the shapes that you use to draw that hand should reflect the movement and the form of the hand itself. Of course, I had to make a great many adjustments, as was the norm throughout the week I spent studying hands. But in order to improve, one must persevere. Just don't push yourself too hard. Saying this from experience. After I drew the hand, I got to work on shading since I also wanted to study the placement of both the shadows and the highlights. And especially since I tend to stray into ambiguous light source territory sometimes. As I was rendering the shadows, I paid attention to how deep they were. That is, which shadows were more intense and which ones weren't. And I also studied the reference photos regularly to determine where the light was coming from and the resulting placement of the shadows and highlights. For example, if the light is hitting the hand from the top, then the palm will be obscured by shadow as well as the sides of the fingers because of their close proximity to one another, preventing light from fully hitting those areas. There were also some parts of the shading that I blurred to reflect the soft edges of the shadows in the original photo. So now for the second round of studies. This time I used my characters as inspiration for the finished hand drawings, because even though these are studies, I had to put a fun spin on these somehow, even though this was a bit of a spur-of-the-moment decision. For each character, I chose a reference photo that I felt fit them in some way or another. For example, Nadia wields a sword, so for her I used a photo of a hand grabbing a sword. Safia's powers have to do with alchemy and transmutation, so I turned this golf ball here into a sort of metallic alchemical object. Peter often utilizes playing cards in combat, among several other objects that he can use at long range. So I used a photo of a hand holding a card. And Lark wields a metal pole when they fight, so I used a photo that came at least close to what I wanted. Unlike the first round of hand drawings, this batch of studies was rendered in full color, primarily for the sake of keeping things interesting. Other than that though, the process was much the same as it was with the first set of studies, so I don't really have as much to say here as I did with the first set. I kept applying everything that I learned, all of my decision-making from the first set, and all of the observations that I felt benefited me and my goals with these studies. I think that's something I struggled with a bit for this round, though, was the length of each individual finger. In quite a few of the cases, I drew them too long, so I had to adjust accordingly. I also had to measure the size of the shapes in relation to the objects each hand was holding, which brings me to one of the harder challenges I faced during the course of these studies. Why was Lark's hand so hard to draw? Well, actually, I think I have a few theories as to why, but this is the main one. The width of the pole itself. The way the hand was wrapped around it in the original photo was in itself a challenge, but the width of the pole was also an important piece of the puzzle, something I didn't quite catch on to until later. 3 of the fingers in the photo extend past the base of the palm and the edge of the pole, and as I was trying to draw Lark's hand for the sketch, I was making multiple blunders. If it wasn't the width of the pole, it was the base of the thumb, the latter of which was the result of me drawing the palm too wide. But eventually, I was able to figure out a solution. In conjunction with the tips and tricks that I applied to my other studies, I decided to block out the pole first using the rectangle tool, as freehanding it didn't do much for me, unfortunately. Of course, this took several tries itself, but once I got the right width, it was almost like magic, and I was able to draw the hand afterward without as many problems. For the coloring, I paid attention to the shadows and highlights once again, carving out both depending on intensity. In Nadia's case, however, I had to play around with the rendering a bit. Because her sword is made up of her own aura, I had to turn some of the shadows in the original photo into highlights instead. And I also did a brief metal rendering study for Lark's sketch. Because even though I like to think that I improved with metal rendering in general, rendering cylindrical objects is something that I want to work on. But regardless, that concluded the second batch of hand studies. I still had a few days to go before the week was up, and for the final stretch, I wanted to do a sort of test of endurance to, Yes, hello. Oh, it's that time again? A word from our sponsors? Sure thing. You there. Yes, you. Are you in the middle of writing your magnum opus of a story, but need to start editing it and don't know how to go about it? Don't worry. Editing your writing with a more critical lens is just one click away with Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes on topics that include illustration, design, photography, video, and more. These classes are taught by folks who represent the top of their creative disciplines, so you can level up in your creative journey with confidence. You'll also get curated sequences of classes to guide you towards your goals, an active community of fellow creators to give you feedback, and certificates and badges to help you celebrate your accomplishments. If you want to get inspired, learn new skills, and make new creative discoveries, look no further than Skillshare. But what kinds of classes can you expect to find on the platform? Well, that brings me to today's class spotlight, How to Improve Your Writing in 10 Simple Steps, by author and environmentalist Tasman Huntsman, who has written several poetry collections including The Anatomy of Waves, as well as the novella Welcome Home, Dear Soul. In this class, you'll learn about, as it says on the tin, 10 ways that you can improve your writing, from reducing any unnecessary bits and improving your vocabulary for your writing, to getting new life experiences for your future projects, developing writing habits, and building your writing muscles. There is a lot of valuable information in this class for any and all writers, whether you're already published or just starting out or have been writing since childhood like me. And I'm excited to get to work on the exercises and put everything I learned into practice going forward. But wait, there's more! If you join Skillshare using this coupon code, you'll get your first month free! Yes, you heard that right. The first month is free. You can also get this discount by clicking on the link in the description of this video, so don't miss this special opportunity to level up your skills. At a discount! Thank you to the folks at Skillshare for sponsoring this video. And speaking of the video, let's get right back into it. So a few days had already gone by, and I was now halfway through my week-long hand drawing journey. I like to think that I had made good progress, but I felt like I wasn't doing enough. I hadn't used more than 1% of my full power yet. I needed to lock in. But how was I going to go about doing that? For the last stretch of this little quest, I challenged myself to draw as many hands as I could over the course of 3 days. Of course, I broke this down into 4 half-hour sprints every day, because let's be real here. There's only so many things you can draw in immediate succession without going absolutely insane. Again, I'm saying this from experience. Anyhow, this part of my studies was less about depth and being refined, and more about getting the shapes down and trying to better understand the positions of those shapes in the pose/photo without overthinking everything, as I am unfortunately wont to do. If you're wondering why I didn't do this first, I don't know, my brain is like that. But if nothing else, I suppose you could call this final stretch a test of both speed and endurance. It was also here that I diverted from the one-hand poses that I had stuck with up to this point. I decided to step out of my comfort zone even further and study reference photos featuring two-hand poses. A lot of these were, as I expected, harder to sketch. But hey, who doesn't love a challenge, am I right? Some of the poses that I found to be more challenging also included this one pose that I did with the two hands clasped together. For this one specifically, it was a matter of understanding how the fingers were woven together, how the hands interlocked, and what shape resulted from that. In this case, the shape of the palm combined with the silhouette of all the fingers together resulted in a sort of pentagonal shape. And from there, it was filling in that shape with the smaller shapes that comprised the fingers and defining the angular curves that made up the joints. And as with all of my prior studies, I made sure to pay attention to the curves, the squishy bits, and the width and length of each shape, including the wrists. For example, if the back of the hand was curved in the photo, I made sure to duplicate that as best as I could. A very helpful tip I should mention that I didn't mention earlier is that if you flip the image, you can better catch the mistakes you made prior to that and then make corrections from there. Rotating the canvas as you draw can also allow you to get a better look at the shapes of the hand, and you can also better understand where each finger ends and how much of the hand is visible to the viewer. But going back to the drawings themselves, even though less focus was on the shading and more focus was on the shapes now, I made sure to assess the space between each finger and each knuckle, the space between each joint, and paying attention to the size and shape of the negative space in the reference photo. As usual, if something wasn't quite right, I fixed it accordingly. I should note, though, that I was still trying to figure out what method of drawing the hand worked best for me. Of course, I did start with the palm and used guidelines to get the shape of the pose and block the shapes that the fingers made first, and sometimes I made little lines to indicate how each finger was bent. And sometimes I also employed the trick of drawing the nail first when those weren't enough to properly portray where each finger ended. This also worked well for the two-handed poses, but another trick that I tested out when it came to drawing those was starting with a thumb or one of the fingers before drawing the palm. As crazy as that probably sounds, there was a reason why I did this, and it was mainly so I could better gauge the distance between hands. Keep in mind, I tried using the selection tool as little as possible. At this point, I had already drawn a lot of hands, and by the time the last day rolled around, I was definitely starting to feel the burn, and I was definitely starting to feel my motivation draining. But I knew I had to persist, so I got a little silly with it and used a couple of poses that I've seen in meme images in some way, shape, or form during my internet travels. You probably recognize these hands yourself. For the grabbing hands, it was a matter of studying how the fingers overlap with the palm and seeing how certain fingers like the thumb and the pinky jutted out in directions that may seem like they defy the rules of reality itself. What can I say, hands work in mysterious ways. Admittedly, I did get hung up on the space between the middle and the ring fingers of the hand on the viewer's right, since it's a considerably wide space and I was drawing it wider than it actually was, but I was able to fix it in the end. For the pointing hand, I started by blocking in the general shape of the fist, paying attention to the indent between the thumb and the index finger before moving on to the index finger itself. I kept the angular shape of the thumb in mind and how the other fingers were folded under the palm before starting the index finger by drawing the nail. As it had been for indicating finger length, it was also useful for rendering and figuring out the dimension of the rest of the finger. To finish that off, I rendered the knuckles. Man, drawing pointing hands has never been so easy. And with that, my hand studying journey drew to a close. So, after all of this, did I improve in drawing hands? I would like to think so, but after a week straight of investing my drawing energy into hands, I think, despite my best efforts, I'm starting to go insane. But these were all of the hands I drew over the last week. Looking back, I do believe that I have been brain-rotted by this challenge because everywhere I go, I only see hands now. But I learned some very valuable information in regards to drawing this subject material and getting my hands to look at least halfway decent. In a way though, since doing these studies, I've already gotten to work on that, and I can already see an improvement. And as I get back to drawing my usual stuff, I want to see how I can apply everything I learned over the last week to my drawing process going forward. So, all in all, I'm pretty optimistic about the future of my hands drawing adventures. But anyway, that is going to do it for this video. If you like this video and want to see more from me, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and stay tuned for upcoming art-related videos and other shenanigans. If you want to support me further, please check out my other social media accounts as well as my ongoing webcomic, my Ko-fi, and my Etsy shop, which are all in the description. And lastly, if you made it this far, leave a raised hand emoji in the comment section below. And remember to keep things civil in the comments, or I will put a whoopee cushion in your chair when you least expect it. And yeah, that's about everything. Thanks for watching.